Snow fell heavily over Aspen Ridge when billionaire CEO Victoria Hale began choking in the center of the Aurora Crown. Crystal chandeliers shimmered against the dark winter night outside, but inside, panic spread like ice fracturing beneath unseen pressure. Dozens of wealthy diners went still. Forks hovered midair above untouched meals. No one reacted. No one seemed to understand what to do until a man in a worn winter coat stepped forward from the back of the room. A single father who hadn't had a proper evening to himself in months. He didn't ask who she was. He didn't pause. He simply acted and saved her life. And before anyone could offer thanks, he disappeared back into the falling snow. Victoria Hale did not take evenings off. In the 14 years since she had founded High-End Systems, she had missed Christmas dinners, birthdays, a friend's wedding in Napa, and even her own 35th birthday. None of that had ever troubled her. What unsettled her was losing a deal she had spent 11 months constructing. The acquisition had fallen apart at 4:47 in the afternoon. That was the exact moment her general counsel, a precise man named Bernard Ashworth, had placed his pen on the conference table and said in a low voice the board voted no. Victoria had said nothing. She gathered her files, walked out from the 42nd floor, took the elevator alone, and stepped into a December evening that was burying Aspen Ridge beneath 2 feet of fresh snow. The Aurora Crown was not chosen for comfort or nostalgia. It was simply the closest place, with a reservation she could secure on 30 minutes' notice, when you were the CEO of a $3 billion technology company. The maitre d' recognized her name instantly without glancing at his system. He guided her to a corner table beside a frost-lined window and left her with a leather-bound menu she never opened. She ordered seared salmon with a citrus reduction and a glass of 2019 Chablis. Around her, the restaurant carried the quiet rhythm of old wealth at ease, murmured conversations about ski runs, and quarterly portfolios, the soft clink of silver against porcelain. Victoria watched the snow flatten itself against the glass and felt nothing in particular. She had built High-End from a 2-person startup in a shared Denver workspace into one of the most closely watched software firms in the country. She had been featured in 4 national publications. She had testified before a Senate subcommittee. She had never once in all that time sat alone in a restaurant and felt lonely. She was not about to begin now. She unfolded her napkin and turned slightly toward the window. Near the service corridor, almost hidden behind a wide pillar, a man named Daniel Carter was reading a laminated menu for the 3rd time. He was 38 years old, wearing a dark green canvas coat that had once been of good quality, and he had ended up at the Aurora Crown by accident, not entirely by accident. He had received a quarterly bonus from his overnight shift at Ridgeline Cold Storage, $230, which was more unplanned money than he had seen in nearly a year. His daughter Lily was spending Friday night with her grandmother Margaret, who lived 20 minutes away, and made better biscuits than Daniel ever could. For the first time in longer than he could remember, he had an evening that belonged to no one else. He had parked on High-End Street, walked past 3 bars, and stopped here because the number on the menu in the window seemed just within reach, and because he was the kind of man who sometimes did impractical things just to understand how they felt. The difference between his table and the one across the room was not something Daniel dwelled on. He had grown up working class, stayed working class, and carried no particular shame about it. He noticed the woman at the corner table the way anyone notices someone sitting alone in a crowded space, briefly, without judgment, before looking away again. He ordered lamb stew and a glass of water, then settled into a meal he hadn't cooked himself. The salmon arrived artfully presented, a pale orange fillet resting on a slate-colored plate with a thin streak of citrus glaze. Victoria lifted her fork. Her mind was still fixed on the failed acquisition, not with frustration, but with the sharp analytical focus she brought to every setback, cataloging what could have been done differently at what point. And by whom she took a bite. The portion was slightly larger than she intended. She reached for her wine. The obstruction came instantly, and completely, not gradual, not warned, but sudden, like a door slamming shut, cutting everything off at once. Her throat simply closed. She set the glass down. Her hand moved to her mouth. She tried to cough, but nothing came. The Chablis tipped a pale spill across cream linen, but none of that mattered because Victoria Hale could not breathe. She stood her chair, scraping sharply across the floor, the sound cutting through the room, and turning heads one by one, slowly, uncertainly, people, trying to understand whether something had fallen or someone had stumbled, rather than recognizing the emergency unfolding just feet from the window. Victoria pressed both hands to her chest. She could feel the pressure, the complete and absolute blockage, and understood with clinical clarity what was happening. Even as her body began to panic beyond her control, her vision sharpened at the edges. She tried again to cough. Nothing. She saw people watching her. She saw no one moving. A waiter 3 tables away had gone pale. A woman in a burgundy dress had shifted her chair back, but remained seated, unsure. A man in a blue blazer half stood, then sat again, as though reconsidering whether he had read the situation correctly. 8 seconds had passed since her chair scraped, perhaps 10. Daniel Carter had been watching because his table gave him a clear line of sight to hers, and he had seen the way she stopped eating, not a pause, not distraction, but the frozen stillness of someone in real danger. He recognized it before anyone else in the room, because he had learned to recognize it. Lily had been diagnosed with severe asthma at age 4 in the 3 years since. Daniel had taken 2 pediatric first aid courses, 1 adult emergency response certification, and had practiced the Heimlich maneuver on a training dummy until the instructor had suggested he had surpassed the requirements of the course. He had done all of this because he was a single father who understood at a cellular level that there was no one else. He was already moving. He crossed the restaurant in 8 strides, which was faster than seemed reasonable given the arrangement of tables, and the fact that he was navigating around a cart and a server and 2 people who had begun to stand. He moved through all of it without breaking pace in the way that people move when they are not thinking about moving, only about what they need to do when they stop. "I've got you," he said. He positioned himself behind her, found his footing, locked his hands just below her sternum, left fist, right hand closed over it, angled correctly, not low, not high, and gave the first compression. Nothing, second, nothing. Third, harder, sharper, the full leverage of his body behind it, and the piece of salmon came free. Victoria's first breath was loud and ragged, and she grabbed the edge of the table with both hands and held it. The room was very quiet around the sound of her breathing. Daniel kept his hands where they were for 1 more second, making sure, and then stepped back. "Breathe slowly," he said. "You're all right, take your time." She turned, she looked at him. Her eyes were wet from the reflex of it, and her face was still pale, and she was gripping the table like it might leave without her. He didn't say anything else. He just waited until the color started to come back. The room had held its breath alongside her, and now released it all at once. Someone began applauding a man near the bar, and others joined. The kind of applause that has more relief in it than celebration. The sound of a room full of people releasing something they hadn't known they were holding. The matrotter appeared at Daniel's elbow. "Sir, that was extraordinary. Please, your meal is entirely on us this evening. Anything you want, we insist." Daniel shook his head once. "That's not necessary." Victoria had straightened. One of her staff, a young woman who had been at a separate table. Daniel realized, observing with controlled alarm, had appeared at her side with a phone already raised. Victoria waved her off with a small motion and looked at Daniel directly. "What's your name?" she said. Her voice was composed. There was only a faint roughness in it to indicate what had just happened. Daniel considered her for a moment. She was tall, composed even now, the kind of person who had arranged herself back into order through sheer will, in the 15 seconds since she'd stopped choking. He didn't recognize her specifically, but recognized her type, the particular quality of self-possession that came from years of being the most important person in every room. "I'm glad you're okay," he said. "That's not what I asked, I know." He picked up his coat from the back of his chair. His lamb stew had gone cold. He folded 2 $50 bills, his bonus, most of it. But the dinner had been a strange idea from the start, onto the table next to the untouched bread basket, and buttoned his coat to the collar. The matri made another attempt. "Sir, please at least let us." "I appreciate it," Daniel said. "Have a good night." He walked to the door. He pushed it open, and the winter came in the particular cold of Aspen Ridge in December. Clean and absolute, and he stepped into it, and the door swung closed behind him. The snow was falling at a slant now, the wind having picked up while he was inside. He pulled his collar up and walked back toward where he'd parked on Heian Street, his footprints filling almost immediately behind him. He thought about Lily. She would be asleep by now at Margaret's, her hair spread across the pillow the way it did when she was deeply under. Her face slack with the total abandon of a 7-year-old who felt completely safe. He thought about calling to check, and then decided not to. Margaret would let him know if anything was wrong. She always did. His car started on the third try. He sat a moment with the heater running, watching the restaurant's lit windows from across the street, and then put it in drive. He was home by 9:30. The apartment on Crestwood Drive was small in the way that apartments are small when they are rented by someone who is carefully managing the gap between what comes in and what goes out. The living room and kitchen shared a single space. The radiator in the corner made a sound like an argument every time it cycled on. The carpet was beige and had been beige since before Daniel moved in and would be beige when he left. He had made it as much his own as a man could, who lived primarily around the life of someone else. Lily's drawings covered the refrigerator entirely and had begun migrating to the kitchen wall in a loose archipelago of construction paper. Her books were stacked on the coffee table in the specific order she insisted upon, which Daniel had stopped trying to understand and simply maintained. A plastic storage bin near the hallway contained her nebulizer, her backup inhaler, her emergency action plan laminated in plastic, and a printed sheet with a number for the pediatric urgent care on Elm. He heated up the soup he'd made on Thursday, a chicken and vegetable with a little too much celery. Lily's verdict, and ate it standing at the counter. The apartment was very quiet without her in it. Not unpleasant exactly, just different, like a familiar song played in a different key. Rachel had died in March, 4 years ago, of a glioblasto that had moved fast enough that they had barely had time to understand what was happening before it was over. She had been 33, Lily had been 3. Daniel had taken bereavement leave and then returned to work at the cold storage facility, because the bills were the bills, and because the alternative sitting still with it was not something he knew how to do. He had learned not the sitting still exactly, but the accommodation of it. The way grief settles into the architecture of a life becomes load-bearing in ways you don't fully realize until you try to move something and find out it was holding the whole structure up. He took the first aid courses for Lily, but also he understood now for himself for the feeling of competence in the face of helplessness, for the specific relief of knowing what to do. His phone buzzed on the counter. Then again, then a third time in quick succession, which was unusual enough that he picked it up. The notifications were from a news alert he'd set up for local stories, which he'd forgotten he had. The headline read, "Winter Guardian Anonymous Hero Saves Hale CEO in Aspen Ridge Blizzard." There was a photograph blurry taken on a phone from across the restaurant. The angle strange that showed the back of a man in a dark green coat performing a compression on a woman who was gripping a table. Daniel set the phone face down on the counter. He washed his bowl. He turned off the kitchen light. He went to bed. The hospital was Street Carver's, which was 11 blocks from the Aurora Crown, and had been where Victoria's company health plan directed executive care for the past 6 years. She had not in 6 years ever actually used it. The attending physician, a composed woman named Dr. Elhela Marsh, had checked her throat, her airway, her blood pressure, and had told her that she was going to be absolutely fine, that the bruising along her sternum would subside, and that she should probably not eat alone at restaurants for a while, which was a physician's attempt at a joke. Victoria had thanked her and immediately requested the discharge paperwork. In the car on the way to her penthouse, her driver Thomas navigating with practiced calm through streets that the snow was erasing. She sat with her phone in her lap and felt something she didn't immediately recognize. It took her 3 blocks to identify it. It was the sensation of having been completely out of control for approximately 45 seconds, and the knowledge that during those 45 seconds, the outcome had depended entirely on a stranger. She was not accustomed to depending on strangers. She was not, in the most technical sense, accustomed to depending on anyone. Her communications director, Patricia Sun, was already awake when Victoria arrived at the penthouse. Patricia had a talent for being awake at the exact wrong moment and managing it as though it were simply another item on the schedule. "The footage is circulating," Patricia said without preamble. Two versions, one from inside the restaurant, one from a guest who filmed through the window. The man in the coat hasn't been identified. There's already a hashtag, Winter Guardian. The sentiment is very favorable. I don't care about the sentiment. You should. It's positive coverage in a news cycle that hasn't been Patricia. Victoria set her coat down. Find out who he is. A pause for the statement. No, because I want to thank him. Patricia left her to it. Victoria stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse and watched the snow cover the city below in slow, complete silence. She had grown up in Whitmore, Colorado, a town whose primary industries were passing through and running out of gas while doing so. Her parents had worked. Her childhood had been functional and not especially warm, which was perhaps why she had spent 20 years building something that was exclusively hers. High-end systems answered to her. Its future was her decision. Its failures were her responsibility, and so were its successes. Tonight, for 45 seconds, none of that had mattered at all. She pressed her palm flat against the cold glass and left it there. It took 41 hours. Patricia's team had a lead by Saturday evening. A server at the Aurora Crown had mentioned to a friend that the man had paid cash and left most of his lamb stew. The friend had posted this. Someone had noted that the coat in the photograph matched one sold at a specific regional workwear outlet. A procurement record obtained through means Patricia did not detail pointed to a Daniel Carter employed by Ridgeline Cold Storage on the overnight shift, resident of the Crestwood Drive area. Confirmation had come through a neighbor, then a cross-reference with a prior news article brief local about a man who had provided emergency assistance at a community center the previous winter. Same name, same coat. He has a daughter, Patricia said, 7 years old, Lily Carter. She attends Aspen Ridge Elementary, single parent. The mother passed away 4 years ago. Victoria absorbed this quietly. Does he know he's been identified? Not yet, but the online search has been active for 20 hours. It's only a matter of time before someone connects the same dots and gets there first. There are already people discussing his neighborhood. How much time do we have? My best estimate, a day, maybe less. Victoria made the decision in approximately 12 seconds, which was her typical processing time for decisions of medium complexity. Book me a car for tomorrow morning. I'm going to meet him before anyone else gets there. Patricia looked at her with the specific expression she reserved for initiatives she considered unwise, but would execute flawlessly regardless. Should I call ahead? Number, should I accompany you? No. Should I at least, Patricia? A car. Tomorrow morning, Patricia wrote something in her notebook. Car. Tomorrow morning, she said in a tone that meant she was also noting her objections for the record. The diner was called Pauline's, and it was on the corner of Reedwood and 5th, and it had been there since 1978 in, the way that certain places persist through sheer stubbornness and excellent pie. The windows fogged from the heat inside. The sign in the door had been flipped to open at 6:00, and the parking lot held 3 trucks and a car with a cracked rear windshield packed with snow. Victoria Hale arrived at 7:45 in a plain gray coat. No driver, no staff. She had taken a cab and then walked the last 2 blocks, which had been colder than she'd anticipated. She had deliberately worn no makeup beyond what was simply her face. She had left her Hausian lanyard in the penthouse and put on no watch she could identify from across a room. She had done all of this because she was trying to show up as a person rather than a position, and she was aware with some discomfort that she was not entirely certain she knew how to do that anymore. Daniel Carter was already there. He was sitting in a booth by the far window with a coffee and a newspaper folded to the crossword, which he was doing in pen. He was wearing a gray thermal shirt and jeans, and looked exactly as he had looked in the restaurant. Unremarkable in the way that people are unremarkable when they are simply being themselves without an audience. He looked up when she came in. His expression shifted through recognition, assessment, and something that might have been the faintest resignation, all within about 2 seconds. She walked to his booth. Mr. Carter, Miss Hale, may I sit down? He gestured at the seat across from him. The waitress, a woman named Gloria, according to her name tag, who had clearly seen everything that Reedwood and 5th had to offer, and remained serene, appeared immediately, and filled a mug of coffee without being asked. Victoria wrapped both hands around it and was grateful. "How did you find me?" Daniel asked. "My communications team, I asked them to, so it's not a secret anymore." "Not to me, but it hasn't reached the press yet, which is why I'm here." He looked out the window for a moment. Two pigeons were conducting some kind of dispute on the sidewalk outside in the cold. He watched them with mild interest. "I didn't do it for a reward," he said. "I don't want anything from you, I know." He looked at her again. "Do you?" "Yes." She said it simply without qualification because it was true the way you left. A moment passed. The coffee was very good. Outside, one of the pigeons lost the dispute and walked away with offended dignity. "Then what do you want?" he asked. "To thank you properly and to offer you something practical." She set both hands flat on the table, a habit she'd developed in negotiations. Hands visible, nothing hidden. The search for your identity is active online. "I'd estimate someone makes the connection to your home address within 24 hours, possibly less. To your daughter's school within 48. Something moved behind his eyes. Not fear. Exactly. "What can you do about that?" "Quite a lot. My legal team can contact the platforms where the search is being coordinated. My communications team can redirect the story, release a carefully worded acknowledgement that the Winter Guardian wishes to remain anonymous, and that his privacy is being legally protected. It generally works. People respect a clearly stated boundary when it's backed by credible consequence. And what does that cost me?" She met his gaze steadily. "Nothing. I'm not offering a transaction. I'm offering a debt repayment." He was quiet for a long time, long enough that Gloria came back and refilled both coffees and left again without comment. "It's not about me," he said finally. "I know Lily doesn't need cameras at her school. She doesn't need," he stopped, rearranged his thought. "She had a hard enough time after her mother. She's settled. She knows what her days are going to look like. That matters to kids. It matters to everyone," Victoria said quietly. He looked at her with a slight shift in his expression, a small recalibration, as though she had said something he hadn't expected from her, which she realized she probably hadn't. "Okay," he said. "Okay, you can do the thing with the legal team for Lily." He picked up his pen and turned it in his fingers once. "Not for me." Understood. They sat with that for a moment. Outside the window, the snow had begun again. Light this time, the small, dry flakes that didn't accumulate so much as drift. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Yes." "Are you going to be okay?" The incident physically. She felt something odd move through her chest at the question, not the question itself, but the uncomplicated way he'd asked it. Not to open a conversation, not to establish rapport, just because he wanted to know. "Yes," she said. "The doctor said I'll be fine." "Good," he nodded. And then after a moment, "You should probably not eat alone." She almost smiled. The doctor said the same thing. Smart doctor. Patricia's estimate had been optimistic. By Sunday afternoon, a journalist from a regional news outlet had arrived on Crestwood Drive with a photographer. They were not aggressive. They were simply present, which was its own kind of pressure. They waited across the street. The photographer had a long lens. Daniel had kept Lily inside, which she'd accepted with the pragmatic resignation of a child accustomed to plans changing without full explanation. He had told her that some reporters were outside because of something that had happened and that they were going to stay inside for the day and that he would make pancakes for dinner, which was a diplomatic triumph. At 3:00 in the afternoon, someone attempted to photograph Lily through the downstairs window when she came to look at the street. Daniel had moved immediately, stepped between her and the window, spoken to her calmly, redirected her to the back of the apartment where they built a blanket fort of some structural ambition. But he had stood at the window afterward, looking at the photographer across the street, and felt the cold, steady weight of something he couldn't manage alone. He called the number Patricia had given him. Victoria had Patricia's team on it within 20 minutes. The legal notice reached the outlet's editor within the hour. By 4:30, the journalist and photographer had gone. By 6, a formal communication had been distributed through the relevant press channels, indicating that the individual known as the Winter Guardian had declined all media contact, and that his family's privacy was to be legally protected. The story didn't die. Stories like this don't die. They simply migrate from active to ambient, but the specific pressure on Crestwood Drive dissipated. Daniel texted, "Thank you." Victoria read it in the back of the car on the way to a Sunday board meeting that could not be rescheduled. She sat with the two words for a moment. She had done a great many things in her career that had been called remarkable. She had closed deals that reshaped markets. She had given interviews that moved stock prices. She had been thanked by senators and governors, and the kind of investors whose names appeared in financial histories. Two words from a man who meant them was she noted different in a specific way that she couldn't immediately categorize. She texted back, "Of course," and then after a moment added a longer pause. Then she ate 6. Victoria looked at that for a moment. Outside, Aspen Ridge moved past in its Sunday afternoon stillness, the streets quiet under the last of the weekend snow. She typed nothing further, but she was almost smiling again. Monday arrived with the particular blankness of a week that begins before you're ready for it. Victoria was in the office by 7, which was normal. Her calendar was fully committed from 7:30, which was also normal. By noon, she had reviewed 3 contract drafts, taken 2 calls with division heads in separate time zones, and approved a budget revision that she had noted was insufficiently conservative. All of this was what her life was. She was good at all of it. The goodness of it was something she had never seriously questioned before. She noticed it for the first time at 2:00 in the afternoon, in the middle of a quarterly review, when her eyes moved to the window and stayed there for a moment without her permission. Below, the street was ordinary with lunch-hour traffic. A woman pushed a stroller. 2 men in construction vests consulted something on a tablet. A boy 7, maybe 8, walked beside an adult with his coat buttoned wrong. One side higher than the other, and the adult didn't correct him, just held his hand and kept walking. Victoria looked away and back to her screen. At 7:00 in the evening, she was in the penthouse, having eaten carefully, with attention, a meal her housekeeper had left in the refrigerator. She stood at the window that looked north toward the Crestwood Drive neighborhood, which she couldn't see from here, and thought about what Daniel Carter had said in the diner. "You should probably not eat alone." She had lived alone since she was 22 and had never experienced it as a lack. The penthouse was everything she had specified: clean lines, unobstructed view, silence she could control. She had cultivated the life she had with deliberate intention. She had made every choice. And yet there was something in the way he had spoken about Lily, about her knowing what her days would look like, that had lodged itself somewhere in Victoria's chest, and was still there now 3 days later, as persistent as a splinter. He had described routine as a gift, as something a child needed the way she needed air. Victoria had spent 14 years building a company. She had in that same period given very little thought to what she was building it toward. Revenue had been the answer for a long time, then scale, then market position. These were real things. They were not, she was beginning to suspect, the whole answer. She was 41 years old. She was the most productive she had ever been. She was also standing at a cold window at 7 on a Monday evening, alone in a silence she had chosen, asking herself a question she had not previously found space to ask. What was all of this for? She didn't have an answer, but the fact that she was asking it felt strangely like a beginning. The Halcyon Community Futures Initiative was announced in February, 6 weeks after the night at the Aurora Crown. It was not a grand press launch. Victoria had specifically requested it not be. It was a press release, 2 paragraphs, clean and factual, announcing the establishment of a foundation to fund emergency response training for workers in non-traditional employment sectors. Overnight staff, seasonal workers, independent contractors. People who were statistically the least likely to have access to professional development and the most likely to be present in communities when emergencies occurred. The release made no mention of the Aurora Crown. It made no mention of the Winter Guardian or of Daniel Carter or of a Friday night in December, when a stranger in a green coat had crossed a restaurant in 8 strides and changed the course of an ordinary evening in an irreversible direction. Patricia had read the draft 3 times and said, "Finally, this is genuinely good. Don't sound surprised. I'm not surprised." "I'm noting it." Daniel heard about it from a colleague at Ridgeline who sent a link without comment. He read the announcement twice standing in the break room during his lunch at 2:00 in the morning. the facility humming around him in its nighttime register. He thought about what it would have meant to him 4 years ago to have had access to those courses, without having to pay for them out of his own pocket or negotiate with scheduling to make the times. Work. It would have meant something real. He thought about calling to say so. He didn't because he didn't know what he would say after that, and he was practical enough to know that some things didn't need saying in order to be understood. The snow melted in late February, which was earlier than usual. It left the streets of Aspen Ridge clean and wet in the mornings, the light different, less refracted, more direct, and the air carrying the particular neutrality of a season in transition. On a Thursday in the last week of the month, Daniel was walking Lily to school. She insisted on this every day she wasn't having a difficult breathing morning, which was most days now that the air was improving along Crestwood, turning onto Elm. Then along the park path that was faster and had better puddles for jumping. Lily was mid-sentence about something complicated involving her friend Ava and a disagreement over whose drawing of a horse was more accurate, when she stopped walking. "Dad, that lady is looking at us." Victoria was on the park path because she had walked to an early meeting rather than driving, which she had started doing in recent weeks because it was good for her, and also because it gave her 20 minutes in the morning that belonged as of recently to no agenda. She recognized Daniel before he saw her. The green coat, the easy walk, the small child beside him who was currently pointing at Victoria with the complete social unself-consciousness of a 7-year-old. She stopped, he stopped. There was a distance of about 15 ft between them on the path, with a bare branched tree to one side and the park fence to the other, and the February light lying flat across everything. "Mr. Carter, Miss Hale, a moment." Lily was looking at Victoria with bright, evaluating eyes, the look children deploy when cataloging a new adult, determining where they fall on the internal scale of interesting to uninteresting. "This is Lily," Daniel said. "I figured," Victoria said. "Hi," said Lily. "Why do you know my dad? We had coffee once," Victoria said. Lily considered this information. Did he do the crossword? "He had one with him. He always has one," Lily said with the weight of long experience. "He does them in pen, I noticed." Daniel looked at Victoria with an expression. She was coming to recognize the slight recalibration, the willingness to revise his assessment of a situation. She thought it was probably the most honest expression she saw on a regular basis. Most people she knew had learned to conceal the moment of revision. He hadn't bothered or hadn't needed to. "The foundation announcement was good," he said. "It's a start. Are you serious about it?" "Yes." He nodded once. Lily had lost interest in the adult conversation and was examining a leaf that had survived the winter on a bench nearby, apparently finding it more compelling. "I'm going to apply," he said, "for the advanced certification. If it ends up being available, it will be." He looked at her. "You're very certain of things. It's a professional habit." "I'm trying to determine whether it's a good one." Something shifted at the corner of his mouth that wasn't quite a smile, but was the territory adjacent to it. "That's an honest thing to say." "I'm working on it." Lily had retrieved the leaf and was now holding it up to the light with the solemnity of a scientist at work. Daniel looked at his watch, then at his daughter. "We should keep going. School starts in 15 minutes, and she gets mad at the substitute teacher if she's not there for the pledge." "The substitute doesn't say it right," Lily said without looking up from her leaf. "She rushes the end. She has opinions," Daniel said. I can see that they stood for a moment longer with the morning between them. The bare tree, the light on the wet path. The sound of Aspen Ridge, starting its Thursday in the ordinary way that cities do. "Thank you," Victoria said. He shook his head slightly. "I just did what anyone would have done." "No," she said, "you did what you knew how to do. That's not the same thing." He was quiet for a moment. Then, fair enough, they went their separate ways, Daniel and Lily toward the school. Victoria toward her meeting, the leaf clutched in a small gloved fist. Victoria walked the rest of the way with her hands in her pockets and the February sun on her face, thinking about nothing in particular and everything at once. It was, she thought, a reasonable way to start a Thursday. It was, she thought, and this surprised her,